There are reports out today that due to American bombing in Iraq and due to the Kurdish fighting, ISIS has lost at least part of the Mosul Dam. So for those of you who don't remember, a few weeks back or maybe a month ago, ISIS fighters actually took control of the Mosul Dam, and that was horrendous news for basically all of Iraq, because if you control the dam, you control the people, because you could essentially flood people whenever you want if you have control of the dam. You can take away their power if you choose to do so if you have control of the dam. So that's when, some red flags really started going up in the minds of American military personnel and in the minds of the leaders here in America and, of course, in Iraq and all across the Middle East, because people thought, oh boy, this is a problem. So it was nothing but bad news for a while, but since we actually started bombing ISIS, and since the Kurdish fighters, apparently they've been armed at least to a certain degree from Washington, now they're actually effectively able to beat back the ISIS fighters. So it's a very complicated situation, and there's a lot of different moving parts to it. Some of it I'm in favor of, some of it I'm against. So when it comes to the bombing of the ISIS fighters, I understand it, and I'm okay with it. Now, like I've stated over and over, I would have done the bombing in a different way, and it's different on two fronts. In one respect, I would have done it through NATO and the UN, so it's not just the U.S. doing it, it's the international community. And in the second area, I would have done it with drones. I wouldn't have done it with actual planes, because I think that if you put American soldiers' lives in danger by having them actually drop bombs from a plane, well, who knows? Maybe ISIS has some anti-aircraft missiles that we were unaware of, and that's a massive problem, and I don't want Americans dying for a fight that's not ours. So with those caveats there and those hedges, I will say I was in favor of bombing the ISIS fighters, and of course you had the other benefit of helping out the Yazidis, or religious minority that were stuck on a mountain and essentially starving to death, and they were thirsty and all that. So we were able to help them. Now, look, I'm not naive. I understand that the reality as to why we actually started bombing ISIS is probably more about the oil that they have control of now. There's been multiple articles that talk about how ISIS fighters are actually making about $3 million a day from oil profits that they sell on the black market. They've seized some Syrian oil fields, and they've also seized some oil fields in Iraq. So this is great news now that finally they're suffering some losses. They lost part of the dam. We can only hope that they lose the entire dam and that they get absolutely destroyed. Because these guys, you have to remember, ISIS fighters, they're the group that was too extreme for al-qaeda. Even al-qaeda said, yeah, sorry guys, what you're doing is killing too many Muslim women and children and civilians, and even we're not cool with that, as vicious as we are. But the most interesting part to the story that came out today is that female PKK fighters, or the Kurdish Workers' Party fighters, on the front line against ISIS are kicking ass. And they're actually the worst nightmare of ISIS. Now, why is that? Well, a lot of people don't know, but the Kurds in many areas are actually, they're much more progressive than anything else we'd see in the Middle East, or, bar maybe Turkey. But, I mean, and even that's questionable. But Vice did a great piece on them recently when it was the Kurdish fighters in Syria. They, of course, essentially want to separate in Syria as well as in Iraq. And they showed how women they're oftentimes security forces, and they're treated much more equally than you see anywhere else in the Middle East, and honestly, oftentimes than you see in the Western world. You have women fighters who are essentially leading the fight. And get this, here's where it gets incredibly interesting. They say, according to the ISIS fighters, they think that according to Islam, their religion, that they actually are guaranteed to not go to heaven if they get killed by a woman. Isn't that fascinating? So because of their backwards, insane beliefs, obviously that's what's leading them to do beheadings and try to establish a caliphate. But it's also, at least partially, what's leading them to retreat more when it's women fighters who are kicking their asses, because they fear, oh my God, I'm not going to get my 72 virgins in the afterlife if I get killed by this woman. So it's a fascinating story, man, and you have to give credit. You have to give credit to the to the female PKK fighters and the Kurdish Peshmerga fighters. Now, the only area where I say I totally disagree with Washington is I wouldn't have armed the Kurds, okay? Don't get me wrong, I want them to win and I want them to beat ISIS, but I definitely wouldn't have armed them. Now, why is that? Because every time the U.S. arms anybody in the Middle East or anywhere, it always comes back to kick us in the ass. I mean, think of what happened with the Mujahideen under Ronald Reagan. Think about what happened when we recently gave humanitarian aid in Syria. A lot of that slipped out of the hands of the FSA, who were the people we were trying to help, and went to Hezbollah on the side of the Assad regime, and went to ISIS, who were also part of the rebel movement. So anytime we arm people or do humanitarian aid in questionable regions, what happened with the Mujahideen with Reagan? Remember, they broke up into the Taliban and al-qaeda. So we armed the Taliban and al-qaeda. And with ISIS right now in Iraq, they're using our Humvees. We're blowing up the shit that we left behind from the original Iraq war. Because ISIS fighters saw them sitting there in the desert and said, okay, fuck it, we'll take them. And they're using the weapons that we left behind. So look, I'm sorry, Kurds, I would continue to do the bombing campaign to get rid of ISIS. I wouldn't arm you, okay? And specifically when it comes to the Kurds, the issue is this. You're afraid that if you arm them, then the PKK, or the Kurdish Workers' Party, they're going to use that to fight against Turkey to essentially try to separate from Turkey as well. The Kurds have always had a thing with Turkey where they've been fighting them, and, you know, in Turkey, they hate the Kurds because there's been a lot of terrorist attacks where they're trying to separate and say, give us total independence. So if you arm the PKK and then the PKK goes and attacks our ally, Turkey, with the weapons we gave the PKK, well, that's a fucking problem. Now, of course, the cover story they give is, no, we're not arming the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK. We're actually arming the Kurdish Peshmerga, who are just in Iraq, and that won't affect Turkey. But who really believes that? That if people come in to help, right, and they need more weapons, what's going to happen? The Kurdish Peshmerga are not going to give the Kurdish Workers' Party more weapons? Of course they're going to give them more weapons. That was the risk running in Syria when people said they wanted to arm the rebels. Yeah, but wait a second. At the time people wanted to arm them, the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, who are the secular guys we like, they were fighting alongside ISIS. So what if people in ISIS ran out of weapons and the FSA gave weapons to ISIS, and then again they used that to turn around and to fuck us over? And, I mean, it's a little more complicated today because ISIS is just flat out fighting the FSA, and the FSA is fighting ISIS and the Assad regime. So it's a lot more complicated than that. But either way, just adding more weapons into the mix complicates the problem. I get it with the airstrikes. I don't get it with the weapons. But look, again, this is a good story, some good news from today. We're learning that the Kurdish fighters are actually succeeding, at least partially, in beating back the ISIS extremists.